Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jay, and in this video, I'll be talking about the Intersection Observer API. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing as I'll be posting web development related content on a weekly basis. My goal with this channel is to help you guys understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript concepts at a deeper level and also help you better prepare for the interviews. With that being said, let's jump into the tutorial. Let's try and understand when two elements are meant to be intersecting. So let's do that by using an example here. As always, I've created an index.html file, a JavaScript file, and a CSS file. And I also have a bunch of images that we will be using while building this project. Okay, so first thing, what I'd like to do is I'm going to create an ID, a div with an ID of parent and a div with another ID of child. So when I do this, I need to also link this uh, CSS file to the HTML page. I'm going to be doing that by passing in the href here, styles.css. Okay, now we have access to this HTML. What I'll be doing is I'm going to create an ID, target the first div, and give it a width of 500 pixels and also a height of 500 pixels. And I'll give this a border of 1 pixel solid, let's say red, or 2 pixels, let's say 3 pixels solid red. I'm going to do a similar thing here where I'll create a 300 pixel width and 300 pixel height to child element, and this will have 1 pixel green. Let's try and open this in the browser. So when I do that, it has opened on port 5501. So let's do this. As you can see, we only see this because I think I might have used the wrong ID. So ideally, we should be looking at two different rectangles, yeah, or squares. So in this case, we have an outer parent, which has the red border, and then the inner child, which has the green border. In this case, since green is within the parent, technically, some part of green is within the parent. In this case, the complete green box is within the red box. That's why these two elements are meant to be intersecting. And the intersection observer will return if these two are intersecting or not. There's a property called is intersecting, and it will return that as true. But let's do another thing here. If I create another div, let's say I'll call this as parent1, uh, it wouldn't have any child within this. When I do parent1 and try to target parent1 with a width of 500 pixels on both width and height, and I'll give this a border color of blue. Now we can see that these two are not intersecting. They share the border, but if you zoom in, you wouldn't see that these two are actually intersecting. But as soon as I move, uh, as soon as I move this uh, div by a negative margin, the div has moved into the parent, the original parent, which is the red box, right? So these two elements right now are meant to be intersecting. So that's the concept of knowing whether these two elements are intersecting or not. Okay, now we know that what an intersecting elements are. Let's try to clean up whatever we have so far and try to come up with a project where we could use the intersection observer API. First and foremost, I'd like to add a body color, background color. I have saved this background color here, so I want to use this background color. Now when I go back to my screen here, we see that yellowish background. What I'll be doing is I'm going to create a div, and this div will be the container. And this container, within this container, what I'll be doing is I'll add a bunch of images which are placed in a column-wise fashion, and the images will be within a div container. So each image will have its own container, and I have few images already in place. These are the images of South Park characters. So I'm going to be using these images on the for this project. So I'm going to add each image and give these an ID. So each image will have its own container div, and then there'll be an image with a self-closing tag. Likewise, I'm going to add this for each and every character. Now we do see these characters here appearing on the browser. So there are, I think, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters or 6 images that we have added to the web page. Now the thing is, let's try to style these elements properly. So I'm going to center these images first by adding a display flex to my container, and then I'll do a justify content center and also align item center. Uh, we should be seeing them in a row right now. So I still want to maintain the column order. What I'll be doing now is to set the flex direction to column. Now we have a column which is centered on the web page, and we are seeing all the characters or all the images on the web page in the center. Let's try to create um, some sort of a class to each of this so that I can use this class to create space between each of these divs, right? So I'll create, I'll just say I'll come up with a class called character. And let's target each of these divs by using the class called character. And I'll be adding a margin of 250 pixels on the top and bottom. Now when I check the browser, we should see that these images, now there is a scroll bar because there is space between each of these images. All right. One thing that we want to do now is our container is our parent element, and these images are our target elements. We are going to observe the intersection between the container and the target element, which is the image here. So whenever we see an intersection between those two, we want to change the style of these images. So by default, let's go back and come up with a style for these images. So what I'll do is I'm going to target the images within the div character and give it an opacity of 0.2. In this case, maybe let's change it to 0.5. In this case, they appear to be disabled, or there is a grayscale appearing on top of these images. So you can see the opacity being applied on these images. Now, what I would like to do here is, whenever an image is within the intersection of the parent element, which is our container, we would like to remove that opacity and make it appear as a normal image. But as soon as it leaves the viewport, or the container in this case, we would like to disable it again. And whenever the new image comes into the container, it should be enabled. So that's what this project is. And we'll try to do the enabling and disabling of these images by using the intersection API, intersection observer API. Okay, now let's try to move on to our JavaScript here. Within this file, we'll be creating an instance of intersection observer and then start to observe the target elements that we are interested in. Before writing any code in this file, let's make sure that this file is actually linked on the HTML page. I see that there is a script.js file already linked on this web page. One thing I would like to do is I want to move this to the bottom of the body just to make sure that all the DOM elements are loaded. So I'm moving back to my script.js file. The first thing that I would do is I'll start by creating an instance of intersection observer. So I'll create const observer equal to new intersection observer. So within the intersection observer, we can see that there are two possible parameters that we can add. One is a callback. This is not an optional thing. It has to be there. And one is an optional object. So it's called as options. But let's start with the callback. I'm going to create an arrow function here. Within the arrow function, there will be a parameter or a param called as entries, and we'll talk about what these entries are and how the entries are populated. So I'll be logging the entries here. Right now we have just instantiated this, and if I log what is there in the observer, we'll see an object here. So there is an instance of intersection observer, and there are certain properties that are there on this observer. One is there's a delay, and there is a root margin, threshold, and track visibility fields. So we'll cover some of these things which are related to this project in a bit. Um, let's also try to look at the methods that are available, right? So one method that we are interested in is observe. Observe is a way. This is how we are going to uh, look at a target element and say that we are going to pass it to the intersection observer, right? Using this observe method. This observe method takes in a target element, and then the intersection observer will take this information and tell whether the target element is intersecting with the root level element or whatever is the root element that has been defined. If there is no root element that is defined, here here if you see the root is null, that means it is the default root will be the document. So let's look at the other thing that we are interested in. So the observe, there is also we can also look at unobserve to stop observing, right? So these are the two methods that we could actually use. Um, okay, so let's go back. Um, Now that we know what an instance of intersection observer looks like, let's try to add some target elements that we want to observe, right? So when I say observe, again, as I mentioned already, observing is just a concept here where we would like to ask the intersection observer that, oh, this is the target element that I'm interested in. Can you tell me if this is intersecting with the root level element or not? Through JavaScript, right? This is all done through JavaScript. Visually, we can tell that, oh, this is intersecting, but programmatically, if you want to know if this target element is intersecting with the document or any root level element, then we will use this intersection observer. Okay, let's try to get some target elements. First of all, I want to get all the target elements first by using a query selector all. So I'm going to call them as characters, uh, and this will do document dot query selector all. Within this, I'm going to get all the characters by their class. Okay, so this is how then I'm going to get a node list of 6 elements. So let's move this out of the way. All right, if I log the characters now and switch back to my browser, I can see that there is a node list with a length of 6, and each of these nodes represents a character. For simplicity's sake, let's also add the names of these characters right below the image so that we can talk about these characters if you are not familiar with the show. So let's also add the character names below the image. Okay, we have added the names of these characters under the image. The next step is to observe these elements and make sure that these are intersecting with the document or not. So the way we do that is by using the observe method available on the intersection observer. Let me switch back to my editor. What I'll be doing is, for example, I'll use the observer.observe method and try to observe the first character. So in this case, my target element is I'm passing in a single target element, and observe method takes only one target element. So you cannot pass in an array directly. So it needs to take in one node element. Let's look what happens after we added this line. So if I switch back to my editor, now we see an uh, extra log, which says it is an entry, and the log number is line number 2, which is the entries. So basically what happens is when we pass in a target element, and if the target element is intersecting uh, with the if there is a change, actually, if it is intersecting or if it is not intersecting, whenever there is a change in the intersection, it tries to uh, call the callback. So this callback is fired off with the target element. So entries here represents the information of the target element. Let's take a look at what is there within an entry. When I open it, this intersection observer entry has a lot of information within this. And within these properties, the properties that we are interested in, one is the target, which tells us which div element this target is representing. The second one is if it is intersecting or not. There is a Boolean value, is intersecting. It is set to true right now. That's because this div is visible currently and it is intersecting with the document element. Let's take a look at what happens when this element is moved out of the viewport. So when I move this out of the viewport, it's completely gone now. In that case, we are seeing that the target is still the same because we are still observing the same element, but the is intersecting part is set to false, which makes sense, right? Because it is out of the root element scope right now. So, and uh, and we are not observing any other elements. We are only observing the first element. That's why there are no more logs that are generated when the new images are coming into the viewport. So how do we fix that? Right now, we are able to only observe one element. The other way is to observe everything individually like this, or loop through all the characters and then add the observe method on each characters. Let's do the latter method and add a for each here, and then each character uh, will be representing that div, and in the observe function, we are going to send that node list, which is that element, within the observe method as a parameter. And what this is essentially doing is we are telling the intersection observer that there are 6 characters and observe each of them, right? And we are looping through those characters and asking the intersection observer that you need to observe this element and you need to observe this for like 6 times. And intersection observer will know that, oh, okay, these are my entries and I need to observe each of these elements whenever their intersection is changing. So let's switch back. Uh, on load, when we do that, the intersection observer entries are 6, right? Because it starts from 0 to 5. In a loop, we have continuously asked the intersection observer to observe these elements. Now, when I expand the first one, the is intersecting is value is set to true. But when I expand the rest of the elements, is intersecting is set to false, which makes sense. Now let's clear everything. Now look at what happens when I move Stan out of the viewport. So let's scroll Stan out of the viewport. When I move Stan out of the viewport, we have seen that it has still not triggered. But what happened is we are seeing that an intersection observer entry appeared for the target Kyle, right? That's because a new element came into the viewport. That makes sense. So we are individually observing all the elements now. So whenever any of these elements come into the viewport or exit the viewport, we should see an entry. So when we scroll this element slightly further, I think there is a margin of Stan that is still within the viewport. That's why we are not seeing the entry triggered. But if I scroll it a bit, now Stan is completely out of the viewport. That's why we are seeing that the intersecting property of Stan is false, and is intersecting of Kyle is already true. We already saw that. Let's clear this, and if I move this again, we will see the intersecting observer entry for the next character, and we still move that character into the center. Kyle will move out of the viewport, and then there will be a new entry for Kyle. So let's do that. So there are two entries that came up. The first one should be for Kenny, and the second entry is the entry for Kyle's exit, right? Kyle has moved out of the viewport. That's why we are seeing that target here as Kyle, and the intersecting is false. This way, we can observe each of these elements and know whether they are intersecting with the parent element or not. Okay, the next step is to change the opacity of the element that where the is intersecting property is true. For that, let's try to go back to our CSS first and add, let's target that image and set that image to have a class called activate. In this case, the opacity will be 1. Uh, Now let's also try to target that element. So in this case, there are multiple entries, and each entry is in the form of an array or a node list here. So what we should do is we should iterate over the entries dot for each here, and within this I'm going to get an entry. So this will be our intersection observer entry. Within the entry, um, what I'll do is I'm going to go into the target element. I'm going to target the target element dot class list dot. I'm going to toggle this. I'm going to toggle a class called activate. I'm going to toggle a class called activate whenever there is a change in is entry property. Is intersecting property. Is intersecting. So if this value is set to true, then I'm going to add the activate class. But whenever this changes to false, I'm going to remove the activate class. So that's why toggle exists here. So having done this, let's go back to our browser and hit refresh. It looks like the class is not yet applied. So let's see why this is not, why the class is not yet applied. Okay, this is applied to the div, I see. So we should do target dot, fine. Actually, we can do this. We can use the same target. Yeah, instead of adding it to the image, let's do this. So if the character is activated, then the image within that character should have an opacity of 1. That makes sense.
If I go back to the browser, we can see that Stan is now activated. And on the right side here, on the DOM tree, you can see that the first one is it is activated. And when I scroll Kyle into the viewport, you can see that Kyle is also activated. And once stan is completely out of the viewport, the activate class was removed. So this is how we can make sure that the other characters are not activated. The only characters that are within the viewport are activated. As you might have observed that whenever, let's say in here, this is Cartman's image, uh, whenever a single pixel of that image comes into the intersection of the document, immediately the class is activated. A class called activate is added to it. That means uh, the callback is fired immediately, even a single pixel is within the intersection of the parent level element. So a single pixel of the target is within the intersection of the parent level element. So for that, let's play with some other combination.
We've already covered one combination where even one pixel of a target element is intersecting with the root element. The callback was being fired. Let's try another combination. What if I want all the pixels of the target element to be visible or to be intersected with the root element before I try to fire off a callback? Let's take a look at how this is achieved. This has to be done by using an options object here, and the property that we are going to use is called as threshold. And the threshold value, this time I'm going to give it 1. Let's talk about what threshold here is. Threshold represents the percentage of intersection uh, between the target element and the root element. So if it's 1, that means all the pixels, or it's like 100%, right? All the pixels of the target element needs to intersect within the root element. Only then you need to fire off this callback. That's what threshold 1 means. And if you don't pass in this value, the default threshold value is 0. That's exactly what the first combination was, where we saw that even one pixel is intersected with one pixel of target element is intersected with the root element. We fire off a callback. So this is the complete opposite of that. Let's take a look at the UI and see how this is reflecting, right? Now, if I want to move Stan out of the viewport, so as you can see, as soon as I move one pixel out of the viewport, because this is exiting element, the activate is removed because all the pixels needs to be visible. Only then you fire off a callback. Or if all the pixels are not visible, you still fire off a callback saying that the intersection is false. Now let's move and let's observe the incoming element, right, that is coming into the intersection. So as you can see now, even there are a couple of pixels that are already intersecting with the document, we still have not fired off the callback. That's why we are not seeing the activate class to the second div element, that is Kyle. So let's wait till the entire image is within the document. See, when I highlight this, as soon as the element is completely within the intersection, it's adding the activate class. Let me just move it slightly below. Now, if you see some part at the below, some part of this element is still not completely intersected. That is below the name. So that's why it is still not in the activate state. But when I move it slightly above, now the complete element is within the intersection. Like all the pixels of that element are within the root elements intersection. So that's why we add the activate class. So that's the purpose of threshold. There are other combinations also that you can use on threshold where you can change it to 50%, right? This is going to affect it like this. So when you move the element out by 50%, it's going to remove the activate class. And also when you bring in an element into 50%, it's going to activate the class for the incoming um, element. So this is how you can play with threshold values. I want to touch upon one last thing before we end this tutorial. That is, there's another property called as root margin. So let's talk about root margin. I'll also change this back to 100 pixels. I mean 100%, right? Threshold value is 1. That means we want the complete image to be visible before I trigger the callback within the intersection observer. So let's go back to root margin. Now, when I do root margin, let me give a value of negative 100 pixels and talk about what this is going to do. So let's take a look at negative 100 pixels. So when I'm here, uh, and when I move the element to exact center, right? So when I hover on this image is in the exact center of the screen. And imagine when I add a root margin of negative 100 pixels, uh, imagine the actual intersection border of the root element is somewhere here, which is, it's like a padding. If you are aware of padding, think of it like the actual border has been moved by 100 pixels within the element. So that's the intersection border. You can imagine as a imaginary intersection border, where once this element hits that border, immediately we try to remove the activation. And when the new incoming element is appearing, although it has completely come into the picture right now. uh, so let's say right now it's completely within the intersection, like the document intersection. But since the root margin is negative 100 pixels, we still have to move this element by 100 pixels to make this to fire off the callback. I hope this made sense. But if not, you can rewind and see what exactly I'm doing. So yeah, that's pretty much it about the concepts of intersection observer. You can also use intersection observer for a lot of other use cases where you want to lazy load images. For example, I don't have to load everything right away. I can dynamically load these HTML elements when one of these elements hits the end of intersection, right? Like at the top of the intersection of the element. This is going to improve the performance when you have large set of images and you don't want to make requests to load up a lot of images upfront. So you want to do a lazy loading, that is only if it is necessary, only when the user is scrolling, you want to fetch new images on demand. That's when you can use it. And also there's a famous uh, design pattern, right, which is the infinite scroll. You can use this intersection observer to do infinite scrolling as well. We can talk about, we can take the same project and talk about infinite scrolling in another tutorial, because I think this tutorial is already like long enough. So I want to end it here, and hopefully you've enjoyed this video and learned something out of this. Hey guys, if you've learned something from this video, like this video and share it in your social circles. Also, consider subscribing, as I'll be posting more videos on a weekly basis. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next one.
Enchanté.